The Nevada desert stretched in every direction, a pale expanse under a sun that seemed intent on baking the earth itself. Heat shimmered across the hardpan, distorting the view of Camp Helios, a cluster of low, sun-baked buildings and open ranges carved into the dust. The facility was a closed world, its purpose hidden from anyone without the right clearances. Those who did enter knew it as one of the most demanding sniper training grounds in existence, the kind of place where even seasoned operators found themselves humbled. At its far edge lay the Ghost Valley Range, a strip of land notorious for exposing every flaw in a shooter's skill, feared even by the best. Claire Winslow moved quietly along the eastern corridor, pushing a battered cleaning cart across the polished concrete. The mop and rags, the bottles of industrial cleaner, all told the story of a woman assigned to keep the place in order. Her uniform was a plain maintenance issue, her hair tucked neatly away. She kept her gaze down, but her work was anything but careless. She cleaned in straight, deliberate passes, dividing the floor into invisible grids, each stroke efficient and even. She never retraced steps, never wasted motion. The rhythm of it felt almost military, though no one paid enough attention to see that. To most, she was just another piece of the background machinery keeping Camp Helios running. Outside, the metallic tang of spent brass hung in the air, carried by a dry wind that scraped dust across the concrete pads. Ghost Valley's firing line was a long stretch of steel benches and racks of rifles waiting for hands that could do them justice. The targets, some stationary and others on remote pivots, stood far out against the pale ridges. Claire stepped onto the range perimeter to empty a trash bin, her path crossing the line of sight between Master Chief Dane Holloway and a group of operators in training. Holloway stood like a post driven into the ground, posture rigid but not forced, his weathered face angled toward the line. Years under foreign suns had marked him in fine lines around his eyes, but those eyes missed very little. Lieutenant Mason Keegan was on the line, his frame squared behind a long-barreled rifle. He moved with the confidence of a man certain of his own precision. Claire's gaze passed over him briefly, just long enough for Holloway to catch the flicker of professional assessment in her eyes, before she turned back to her work. She knelt to wipe down a stand, and without seeming to think about it, her body shifted into a textbook firing stance, weight balanced, elbows angled just so. It lasted only a second before she straightened and went back to cleaning. Holloway's brow tightened slightly as he watched, filing the detail away without comment. Around them, the desert wind carried grit that scratched at skin and gear alike. The ever-present reminder that in this place, every movement counted, even the smallest ones. By mid-afternoon, the sun had shifted into a harsher angle, casting long shadows from the rifle racks across the firing line. Heat waves shimmered over the far targets, the mirage distorting them into ghost-like shapes. Lieutenant Mason Keegan stepped back from his firing position, the scoreboard flashing his new record for the day. His smirk was broad and deliberate as his eyes drifted toward the maintenance cart at the edge of the range. He called out for someone to make sure the floor by his lane got extra attention, saying it was only right after history had been made. Several of the younger shooters chuckled. Claire Winslow kept her head down, pushing the mop across the concrete. For only the briefest instant, her gaze touched the rifle in his hands, noting the fine adjustment on the scope. Holloway, standing near the instructor's bench, caught the movement and the focus behind it. It was the same kind of look he had seen in professionals assessing a weapon before a shot. The day wore on, and the wind began to pick up. Flags along the range edges shifted in irregular patterns, warning of crosswinds that could push a shot just wide. Several shooters struggled with the third target in the sequence, missing by slivers despite solid fundamentals. Claire moved past one lane where a young operator was clearly frustrated. Without being asked, she paused beside him, glanced toward the flags, and said quietly that he should hold half a minute into the wind for his next shot. Her voice was calm and matter-of-fact, carrying no weight of suggestion that it might fail. The operator adjusted, squeezed off a round, and watched the target register a perfect center hit. He blinked in surprise, then tried again with the same result. Holloway's eyes shifted from the target back to Claire, who was already walking away without acknowledgement. The metallic clink of brass hitting concrete and the steady rhythm of rifles firing filled the range, punctuated by the occasional call of wind changes from the instructors. Claire moved along the periphery, pausing at times with the faintest tilt of her head, narrowing her eyes at shooters' postures or their handling of the rifles. Holloway's gaze followed her more often now, the tightening of his jaw the only sign that his curiosity had deepened. She offered no more advice, keeping to her work. The earlier moment folded away like a page in a closed book. When the range went quiet and the last of the operators left, Claire remained. The low sun threw a deep orange light across the valley floor, shadows stretching long and thin. She stepped into an empty lane, set her mop aside, and without a rifle in hand, mirrored a perfect firing stance. Her breathing slowed, her weight shifted into exact balance, and her hands shaped an invisible grip. The wind brushed against her face, and she made a minute adjustment for it before lowering her arms and returning to her cart. The late afternoon sun turned the desert ridges to bands of gold and shadow when the convoy of dark SUVs rolled up to Ghost Valley. Admiral Jonathan Rains stepped out first, his uniform immaculate despite the heat, his stride measured and purposeful. The air on the firing line shifted, operators straightening, conversations dying mid-sentence. His gaze swept the range with the calm precision of someone who had seen 100 such places and measured every one of them. Master Chief Dane Holloway met him with a crisp nod, explaining that the day's final qualification rounds were about to begin. Lieutenant Mason Keegan stepped into position when his name was called, his shoulders loose with confidence. He handled his rifle like an extension of himself, checking his scope with practiced economy before settling in behind the weapon. His breathing was steady, his trigger squeeze unhurried. The sharp cracks of 5 well-placed shots echoed downrange, each met with the distant clang of perfect hits. The scoreboard flickered, then flashed his score in bright confirmation. Flawless! Applause broke from the assembled trainees, and Keegan's smile widened as he glanced toward Claire Winslow near the edge of the line, her mop bucket at her side. He didn't say anything this time, but the look was enough a quiet assertion that she belonged nowhere near the firing bench. Holloway asked if anyone else wished to challenge the top score. Silence held for a few seconds until Claire's voice, even and unhurried, carried from the sideline. She asked if she could try. The reaction was immediate snorts of laughter, exchanged glances. Keegan, shaking his head with a smirk that said it all. Holloway studied her for a long moment, weighing something only he could see, before turning to unlock the cabinet behind him. From inside, he withdrew his personal rifle, a well-kept precision weapon, with a matte finish worn smooth where countless hours of use had polished it. He held it out to her grip first. The moment her hand closed around it, her posture changed. Her shoulders drew into perfect alignment, her stance anchored, her breathing slowed. Every trace of the maintenance worker faded, replaced by something sharper. She stepped to the bench, adjusted the bipod, and sighted in. The crosswind tugged at the range flags and a smear of glare slid across the optics, but she moved through it without pause. 5 shots broke in rapid but controlled succession, the rhythm exact, the recoil absorbed into her frame. The scoreboard blinked and announced the result, perfect. The laughter had stopped after the second shot. By the time the score appeared, the line of operators stood silent, eyes shifting between her and Holloway. Keegan's smirk was gone. Admiral Rains stepped forward, his voice cool and measured as he ordered the advanced configuration, a target sequence meant for final day graduates. New distances, sharper angles, more erratic movement. Claire nodded once, adjusted her position, and began again. 5 more shots rang out, each finding its mark, despite a shifting crosswind and the subtle rise of heat mirage near the horizon. The second perfect score lit the board, erasing any doubt. She set the rifle down with care. The same hands that had minutes ago been wringing out a mop now resting easily at her sides. No one spoke, but in the stillness, the shift was complete. Respect had been earned, and there was no going back. The air on the range seemed to hold still after the second perfect score. Admiral Jonathan Rains studied Claire Winslow with a gaze that measured more than marksmanship. When he spoke, his voice was quieter but carried an unmistakable edge of command. He addressed her as Colonel Winslow. The title landed with a weight that rippled through the group. Holloway's head turned sharply toward her. Keegan's expression froze somewhere between disbelief and dawning recognition. The Admiral explained that she was the original architect of the Ghost Valley course, presumed killed in action during a classified operation. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the sun glare and desert wind had been replaced by a new atmosphere entirely. Rains ordered the range cleared under an indigo-level security protocol. The junior operators were sent away, their murmurs quickly fading beyond earshot. Only Holloway, Keegan, 2 senior officers, and Claire remained as they followed the Admiral into a building at the edge of the training grounds. They passed through reinforced doors and down a narrow hall until they reached a windowless room. The walls were matte and soundproofed. 2 security personnel took position outside, their boots still visible under the doorframe's small gap before it shut with a final, locking click. The air was cool and held the faint smell of old paper and electronics. The Admiral placed a thick folder on the table, its tab marked with multiple security warnings. His tone remained formal, but the edges softened when he spoke of her past. He described her final mission in clipped but clear detail, a forward deployment to test new sniper methodologies in hostile terrain. The team had been ambushed. The official report stated there were no survivors. 18 months later, intelligence from a deep cover source suggested otherwise, and a recovery operation had brought her back from captivity. He explained that the injuries she had sustained were compounded by significant memory loss, leaving her procedural skills intact but her personal history fragmented. Claire sat with her hands folded loosely on the table. Her posture was upright, her breathing steady, and her eyes fixed on the Admiral, though it was difficult to tell how much she absorbed. The officers around her shifted in their seats. Keegan's gaze stayed down, his jaw set, the earlier bravado replaced by something more guarded. Holloway kept his expression neutral, but there was a glint in his eyes, a recalibration of respect in progress. When Rains finished, the room was quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Claire finally spoke, saying that hearing the account felt like reading about someone else entirely. She did not dispute the facts, but did not claim them either. The Admiral acknowledged this with a slow nod. He slid the folder toward her, telling her it contained the complete record of her service. The locked door behind them seemed to press the moment inward, the way it bound all of them to a truth that would not leave this room. The weight of her erased history sat between them in the form of that folder, a reminder that the past could be documented in ink, yet still remain out of reach. The air in the secure room had settled into a quiet tension. Admiral Rains leaned back slightly in his chair, the folder still open between them. Pages turned to after-action reports and commendations that charted an exceptional career. He spoke evenly, explaining that her procedural memory was clearly intact. The way she moved, the precision in her shooting, the instinctive corrections, all of it proved the skill set had never left her. What remained fractured were the personal memories, the lived moments that connected those abilities to the person who had earned them. Holloway listened, arms folded, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Claire as if gauging how each word landed. The Admiral offered her 2 paths. She could begin the reinstatement process, reclaim her rank, and return to full duty, though that would require extensive debriefing and the risk of triggering difficult recollections. Or she could remain classified as killed in action and serve in a covert advisory role, working alongside Holloway to train the operators without the burden of public status. Holloway added that she could start as early as tomorrow, if she wished. The suggestion was not casual. It carried the quiet assurance that she already belonged in that role. Claire sat still for a long moment before replying that she would need time to decide. There was no resistance in her voice, only the steadiness of someone who understood the weight of both choices. The Admiral agreed, closing the folder with deliberate care and sliding it across the table to her. That night, in her quarters, she sat at a small desk with a single lamp casting a warm circle of light. The classified file lay open before her, the heavy paper holding the scent of ink and age. She turned pages slowly, her fingertip tracing the margins of typed reports, pausing over photographs of people and places she could not place in her mind. One image showed her in a desert wind, rifle slung, eyes locked on something beyond the frame. The woman in the picture was unmistakably her, yet felt like a stranger. The base was quiet. The muffled sound of distant footsteps passing down the corridor and the low hum of ventilation, the only interruptions. Outside her window, the night over the Nevada desert was deep and still. She closed the folder, resting her palm on its cover for a moment longer before setting it aside. The light caught on the edge of the manila, making the printed security stamps stand out in stark red. In the dim, she understood that the decision ahead was not about reclaiming a life she could not remember, but about shaping the one she had now. The door was open. She simply had to choose how to step through. The morning light fell clean and sharp across Ghost Valley, carving deep contrast between the firing line's concrete edge and the desert beyond. Claire Winslow walked beside Holloway, her pace even, her hands tucked loosely into the pockets of her khaki range jacket. She had agreed to observe, not to participate, but there was an unspoken understanding that her presence alone would shift the morning's rhythm. Operators straightened as they noticed her, conversations dipping into brief pauses before resuming with a different undercurrent. Lieutenant Keegan stepped forward when they reached the line. His shoulders were squared, but his tone was measured as he apologized for his earlier remarks. She regarded him steadily, then nodded, telling him she accepted. The words carried no warmth, but no hostility either, as if the matter had been set aside entirely. Keegan gave a short nod in return before stepping back to his lane. Claire stood just behind the shooters as the first round of drills began. The crack of rifles split the dry air, bolts cycling with clean metallic clicks, targets resetting in the distance with mechanical precision. Her eyes tracked the sequence, noting minor shifts in shoulders, the subtle delay in breath releases. Holloway caught the almost imperceptible nod she gave when a shooter's movement matched the rhythm she was looking for. After several passes, she stepped forward and addressed the line. She explained that most of them were holding their breath too long when transitioning between targets, which was costing them fractions of accuracy. Taking a rifle from the rack, she dropped into position, her movements smooth and unhurried. She demonstrated a firing cadence that kept breathing fluid and consistent, pausing between targets without locking the chest. When she stepped back, the operators adjusted accordingly. The difference was immediate tighter groupings, steadier recoveries between shots, and fewer compensations for missed aim. The sound of the range shifted, the rhythm becoming more uniform, more deliberate. Range flags along the periphery moved in a light wind, small changes in their angle catching Claire's eye as she watched the shooters adapt to her guidance. Holloway remained at her side, saying little but taking in the transformation. The curiosity that had greeted her arrival was giving way to something more grounded trust, earned not by competition, but by proof that her insight worked. Claire gave a final nod, satisfied with the adjustments, then stepped back, allowing the drills to continue without further comment. By the time the session ended, the operators' postures had subtly changed. They carried themselves with more assurance, the kind that comes from understanding a principle rather than just following an order. Claire felt no need to mark the moment aloud. The results were visible in the paper targets stacked by the range office. Holloway glanced toward her, a faint smile in his eyes, and she returned the look with quiet acknowledgement. She had not reclaimed her past here, but she had affirmed her place in the present, one precise adjustment at a time. Admiral Rains extended the offer in his usual deliberate tone, calling it an unofficial position as Special Technical Advisor to Ghost Valley. It would keep her name off formal rosters, but give her complete freedom to shape training alongside Holloway. Claire Winslow listened without rushing to respond. When she did speak, her voice was calm and unwavering. She would accept, but only if every operator she trained knew her current status, not the full classified account. But the truth that she was neither the rank in the record nor the janitor they had assumed. The Admiral met her eyes, then nodded his agreement. 6 months later, the range and its program had changed in visible, measurable ways. The qualification boards showed numbers higher than any in its history. Operators moved with greater consistency, their form sharpened by hundreds of small corrections that had become second nature. Claire's role had expanded without fanfare. She could be found in the training bays demonstrating a movement sequence, on the range walks with Holloway discussing wind patterns, or in the dim light of the office, reviewing data logs from the day's runs. Her presence was a constant quiet, but commanding. The Nevada desert light was unforgiving, bleaching the range markers to a pale memory of their original red and orange. She had walked past them every day, the fading colors a reminder of both the endurance and the evolution of the methods she had built here. In her quarters, the wall space held an unusual mix framed commendations she did not remember earning, alongside recent photographs of the trainees she now guided. The room felt neither like an officer's quarters nor the bare dorm she had occupied before. It was its own balance of past and present. The operators now returned her glance with straightforward respect, a tilt of the head or a small shift in stance when she approached. There was no hesitation in following her direction, whether it was an adjustment in breathing rhythm or a recalibration of scope settings. Holloway had ceased introducing her by any title. She simply was Claire, and her authority was self-evident in the results. In the center drawer of her desk rested a thick, well-used training logbook. Its pages were filled in her precise handwriting, recording adjustments, weather notes, and the progress of each operator. It was a living record of her current contribution, untied from the medals in her file, but no less significant. She carried it under one arm as she stepped out into the sun, crossing the heat-shimmered concrete toward the firing line. She still wore no insignia, no markers of formal rank, yet there was no question of her place here. Authority was no longer something she had to reclaim. It was something she enacted daily, sustained not by what she had been, but by the consistent proof of what she could do. The late-day light stretched long across Ghost Valley, turning the ridges a deep copper and pulling shadows like ribbons across the firing line. The air had cooled just enough for the wind to sharpen, shifting erratically and rattling the range flags in restless bursts. Claire Winslow stood just behind a young candidate at the qualification lane, her voice steady and even as she guided him through the chaos. She told him when to breathe, when to let the wind settle, and when to trust the shot, despite the flag's uneasy twitching. His shoulders eased under her direction, the rifle no longer jerking under tension but flowing through each movement with quiet intent. When the final round struck cleanly, the metallic ring of the target cut through the wind. The candidate exhaled hard, a smile breaking across his face as the scoreboard confirmed his pass. He turned to thank her, but she simply nodded and told him to write down exactly what he had felt in those last 3 shots before it faded from memory. He left the line with his rifle cradled carefully, and she watched him go with the faint satisfaction of knowing the skill would stay with him long after this day. Holloway approached without sound, the crunch of his boots on gravel only reaching her when he was close enough to speak. He said the kid had been struggling all week, and that whatever she had said today had shifted something in him. She kept her eyes on the far targets, telling him that sometimes It was not about the exact words, but about giving someone a rhythm they could trust when the conditions turned against them. They stood in silence for a moment, the flags snapping lightly in the background. Holloway asked if she thought her full memory would ever return. She answered honestly she did not know, and perhaps it no longer mattered. The parts of herself that had been lost did not erase what she could do now, or the way she could pass it on. He nodded, his expression one of mutual understanding rather than pity. As the range emptied and the last of the operators drifted toward the mess hall, the light thinned toward gold, and then into the first shades of evening. Claire walked to an empty lane, the quiet broken only by the faint metallic ping of rifles cooling on the racks. She picked up a rifle and checked the chamber out of habit, then set her stance and sighted downrange. The wind brushed past her cheek in subtle changes, the kind she could feel without seeing the flags. Her breathing fell into the same cadence she had just taught, her hands steady and sure. She did not fire, only held the sight picture as the sun dipped lower, the targets fading into silhouette. The range was hers in that moment, not through ownership, not through rank, but through the enduring fact that her skill lived here, passed on in countless small ways. The day's work was done, but the legacy continued. One candidate, one quiet correction, one steady hand at a time.